Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to have our three panel participants here today. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a second. Doug Cutting, David Nalley, Maxime Beauchemin. So we are going to be talking about open source. We're going to be talking about VCs. We're going to be talking about clouds. And we're going to be talking about how these all come together and affect analytics and open source communities, as well as the users. So let me start out by just letting people introduce themselves. I'm just going to, Doug, I show you first in the video. Why don't you just give us a little bit about who you are and how you got involved in open source?
Sure. I'm Doug Cutting. I am retired at this point, so I can say whatever the hell I want. Watch out. I've been involved in open source since I was a student in college in the mid 80s, but really as a dominant part of my career since 2000. So had an active 20 some years in open source as a career. I started the Lucene project there in 2000. Then later, Nutch, Hadoop, and Avro were things that I instigated. And all these ended up at Apache. Most of them started there. I served on the board of directors at Apache for 4 years, chaired it for a couple of those. So I've been an open source guy for a while. The short answer.
Great. David.
Yeah, so my career is not quite as stunning as Doug's has been, but I'm a recovering sysadmin who got involved in open source because I had problems to solve of my own, and I found that open source allowed me to go solve some of those problems, and then that led me into contributing more. And early days, I started out with working on some projects that were run primarily by folks in Germany that I don't think exist anymore today as projects. And then that led me to the Fedora project and working on Linux distributions. And then that led me to doing some open source startups, eventually bringing an infrastructure as a service project to the Apache Software Foundation, where I kind of found a home and a place that was really welcoming from an open source contribution standpoint. And so brought that project to the Apache Software Foundation, started getting really heavily involved, and ended up, I served a term on the board of directors, and then acted as the vice president of infrastructure, and then ultimately executive vice president, and now president of the Apache Software Foundation. My day job is that I work for Amazon Web Services and help run a team focused on open source strategy and marketing, and making sure that we're being good open source citizens and investing in something that everyone, including us and our customers, make use of.
Great. Thank you very much, Max.
All right, I'll go next. So my name is Max. I'm originally got involved in open source in 2014 when I joined Airbnb with the premise of working on open source. I'd been really inspired working at Facebook before on looking at all the open source projects that had incubated there. Been, playing with Linux since, probably a decade at that time. So I was really inspired to come and start working on open source. At Airbnb, I started Apache Airflow and Apache Superset. Actually, they were not Apache projects when I started them, but then joined the Apache Software Foundation as a mean to keep working on these projects forever, unbounded, and not necessarily in a way that's tied to my employer. And then more recently, so about 3 years ago, I started a company around Apache Superset. The company is called Preset, and we offer a managed service, and then around Apache Superset and tools and services around it too. So kind of did the whole journey, the whole journey from starting open source project, building communities, joining a software foundation, starting a company. And now I'm also involved with other companies in the analytics space as a, either angel or or advisor too. So I've been like really close to a bunch of founders in the space, and the interesting vantage point in the modern data stack and open source and analytics over the past 5 years or so.
Great. Let's dive into that topic then. So I want to start with venture capitalism, and there's venture capitalists love open source. I don't think it was always that way, but it certainly seems to be the case now that there's a pattern where you get a popular project, you fund it, it goes public, and everybody becomes rich. So how is that? I just want to throw out the first question is, how has that changed open source, or has it? And so anybody want to jump on that one?
I'm happy to start.
You've seen a few cycles of this, I think.
I think it's mostly a bad pattern. I think in particular, the pattern that I think is bad is the one-to-one mapping between project and startup. I think it's really hard not to end up compromising the open source project. So it goes back to what you think open source is, sort of definitionally. And for me, open source is a collaboration of people from a number of different places sharing software, and as Maxime noted, separate from their employment long term. That the developer's relationship with the software is somewhat independent of their employment, and tying a company who's trying to become profitable in a small number of years, and the way you do that is by having some exclusivity, and exclusivity and sharing are at odds, and I think it can be really hard to tease those apart. I distinguish this from companies that try to combine a number of different open source projects, each of which are probably themselves used by, contributed to by a number of different companies, and combine them into a single product. That is, I think, a much healthier pattern. The Red Hat is the classic of that. But the one project, one company selling the blessed version, I think has a lot of pitfalls that we've seen through the years.
Anybody want to weigh in on that one? Is it,
Yeah,
do you see it as an anti-pattern, and how do you cure it if that's the case?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of pros and cons. I think we've identified a lot of the important cons. There's some pros too. Like one is, well, so first, the core governance model of open source is meritocracy, right? And what happens when money gets injected in one or many organization around a project is it creates an opportunity for people to build a lot of merit, or for an organization or individuals working for a certain organization to create a lot of merit, and the power, there's patterns around like the power of the merit will concentrate around an organization, right? And then I think we all here value diversity of, organizational diversity in an open source project. So it goes a little bit against that. But the plus side is the injection of capital allows for the software to be built faster, right? More people to be paid to work on the software gets the software to evolve and get better faster. So for me, when I started Preset, I took on some venture capital, and that allowed me to hire a bunch of people to work on Apache Superset. Now the question is what's the governance model, and how do we make sure that, that we provide the right set of guarantees to the community, right? And I think with the governance model, like the one on the Apache Software Foundation or elsewhere, or just, projects that will be very upfront about their governance model and how they can maintain organizational diversity, the ability of anyone to come in and contribute, become a committer, is really key and important. So, I think there it's about governance, it's about actively working the community and fostering this diversity of contributors from different organizations. But it is challenging because by nature, the organization, that takes on capital will accumulate a lot of merit, right? So the way we counter that is probably, mostly with governance principles.
So I think that I think the pattern of open sourcing is attractive because there's some inherent trust built in the relationship between open source producer and open source consumer. And the patterns that we see in terms of adoption are pretty high because there's very little friction in choosing to adopt open source in most enterprises. And so, that's why open source is so appealing to VC funded startups, because it really accelerates adoption and it removes a lot of friction to adoption. But I always share Doug's concern that if your value proposition is that you're selling something that is available freely, I'm not sure that that's a value proposition that is going to stand the test of time. And whether that's operating something or combining multiple things that are freely available and making it easily consumable, I think that companies need to be very crisp on understanding what their value proposition is, because it probably is not selling software, or at least not a single piece of software.
I think
Exactly.
the pattern, though, the question as to whether it is virtuous or not, or functions or not, and there can be a value proposition by a commercial open source company is clearly yes, right? Like you look at companies like, Confluent, and there's just like many companies out there offering commercial solution around open source software and patterns that work. Like one is offering a managed service on the cloud. There's like all sorts of value proposition around Crust, right? Like just open core and building, Crust integrations, extensions of a variety of extensions. So there's clearly a pattern that's been proven to work. And there's probably multiple patterns that are proven to work, right?
I want to emphasize something that both of you guys said. Maxine said that, or Max said that, keeping it Apache helps to keep you honest. And I think that's really true. I think just using the Apache license is not enough. Apache, I think, can force you to play nice with other contributors. And it becomes a little bit of sometimes of a conflict. But the other aspect, I think, is going into it with clear eyes. When you get a VC, I think what David was talking about, that you need to be okay with your competitors, even who may not exist yet, your future competitors, using your software and building a competitive product as well, and then with the idea of collaborating with your competitors. And so you need to have a business plan that allows for that. Because what you see happen frequently is competitors come along and all, in some open source project, people go, whoa, what are you doing? And it's like, they're doing what you said they could do when you publish it under this license. And it's surprising, though, how often that happens. So anyway, just wanted to emphasize both of those points.
Well, yeah, and so following on to this, like imagine we had, somebody, Max, you've been an entrepreneur, Doug, you've been, David, I think you've all had these experiences. You've got something, you're looking at a VC who's holding you, potentially handing out a bunch of money. How do you avoid this quandary? Is it put it in the foundation right from the start? What are your recommendations to people who want to build successful open source projects, but also want to preserve that bond with their community?
I mean, the first recommendation I would say is like work with VCs that understand open source and everything that relates to it, right? So on my board, I have Martin Casado, Tomasz Tongus, people from A16Z and Redpoint, and they understand open source, commercial open source, the tensions and the virtuous kind of cycles that exist, right? And I think like they understand the power of the community. And the different commercialization models that work around it. So smart VCs that understand open source, that treat it as a garden, not a factory to kind of squeeze value out of, I think is really, really key and important. So take smart money, make sure you have the right partners, the right investors, and that you're aligned on the way that you think about your relationship, the relationship of your company and the open source community and project.
And Superset was long in the Apache Foundation when you got funding for Preset, correct?
Yeah,
Or-
and you know, like kind of going back to the previous question, or just a thought that attached nicely to this is like I think there's something around like life cycle of open like companies and open source, right? So there's maybe that's a way for in some cases for software to start to exist, right? In my case, there probably would not be a company if it wasn't for the open source project originally. So in my case, started the project at Airbnb. The project was widely adopted in a bunch of places. People wanted for us to bring that under a software foundation so they could contribute. I think folks from Cloudera, Hortonworks at the time wanted us to bring the software under the Apache Software Foundation so they could get involved more. Like it would provide the guarantees required for them to get involved and contribute. And you know, did that candidly too. I did not necessarily have the intention of starting a company at the time. That became an opportunity later on too, right? So I think there's a pattern there of kind of large technology companies fostering open source, you know, and now founders kind of taking that and starting companies around them. And that is a path to existence in some ways for some companies to in a pattern that's getting replicated now.
So kind of a follow on again to this notion of community license changes. There's been a bunch of them over time. How do you all feel about them? Is this an unadulterated evil, or is it a sign that maybe open source licenses also need to evolve as times change? Just interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, a lot of these licenses aren't technically, the people they're switching to are not open source licenses. So they're in many cases leaving the open source sphere. And I think because of a lack of foresight of not understanding what it meant when you built a company around open source, what you had to permit your competitors to do, and maybe they had that foresight, and that, you know, maybe it was if you're more charitable in their foresight, then you get more cynical in their intent, which becomes then bait and switch. You try to grow the project by getting people interested in this free thing, and then you retain control of it so that you can relicense it under a more restrictive license. And that's we've certainly seen that happen with you know, SSPL and various other licenses.
I think I agree with Doug there that either it's lack of foresight or it's really cunning foresight. I don't think that there's anything inherently evil about proprietary or non-open source licenses, but I think it's an interesting shift, and you know, in many ways, a lot of the people who are consuming software today don't really care and don't understand about open source. But you know, I think some communities view that as an absolute betrayal, and that's a bad thing. Others, you know, they don't care. They're trying to solve a problem, and the software solves a problem for them. And I think that is, as open source has become much more mainstream, that has become a prevailing attitude, is that folks are more worried about friction of adoption and having to deal with legal and procurement to get software, and open source solves that. And some of these other non-open source licenses solve the same problem for them. And so, you know, I think that there are some folks who do absolutely care deeply about it. I dislike seeing it because I think it closes off a lot of innovation to companies who are not willing to adopt it, or who inject a lot of friction to adopting such licenses.
Yeah, I have a lot to say on this topic too. So one thing we think very actively about at commercial open source companies is, you know, how we're going to contribute to the open core and how we're going to differentiate and then, you know, commercialize something. So, you know, clearly a lot of people are commercializing a managed service. that is, kind of a clear way to offer something that people care about in this cloud era. But a lot of people are looking to build trust on that open core, right? And that's often where people apply these like copyleft licenses, or these licenses that are less permissive. And then we've seen too, people just kind of change the license, the software. That's what you guys refer to, right? We've seen like companies like Elastic or Redis, like, just go and like, you know what, like from now on, we're going to fork our own project, and this new fork that it becomes like the trunk, really the main fork really is going to become less permissive, and that creates a lot of tension. There's clearly like a life cycle type thing too, where people early on are incentivized to really like shoot wide, make it really open, get a lot of adoption, and then later on they realize, oh my god, maybe I gave out too much, and now I need to protect this. And I think it shows for lack of clarity up front, right? Of like they did not understand, and now they're trying to kind of change their ways. So I think it's really important for people to be thoughtful and upfront and sharing with their community their intention around software licenses, and what is core, what is crust, what is license used for against these boundaries. And it's also important for that stuff to be understandable by people, right? Like, so what we've seen now is like companies just make up their own license. They employ a lawyer, and they're like, oh, here's the Confluent license, right? Or here's the Redis license, and here's the preset licenses. For me, I think we need to have like standard licenses that are well understood, human readable, because a lot of these licenses are not human readable. You don't really know what, different flavors of AGPL and SSPL, like what does that mean to mortal? So I think we really need to have like a limited set of licenses that are really clear and that people understand. And then people in communities, like particularly commercial open source company, need to be really upfront about which licenses they're going to use in which areas, and kind of commit to that, right? And so that is like somewhat tricky, because people don't really care. You guys mentioned that too, where people don't necessarily understand or care. Is it on GitHub, yes or no, right? And I don't necessarily care if it is like a particular flavor of a license or another. Or some people care a lot, some people don't care as much. It's
Yeah,
tricky.
I think that's a great point about license entropy that you brought up, and I'm sure we could go deep on it. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and go to a completely different area, and that's Hacker News. And if you're on Hacker News, it's almost a meme that somebody posts something, and the second comment up will be, the public cloud is killing open source. And David, I know in your day job, I think that's something that you probably think about, and I'm just wondering, what is your perspective on how do open source and the public cloud, play together for you at Amazon?
So, as with everything, there are upsides and downsides to it. On the upside, I think that it makes any given open source project that's adopted or run in a cloud, it makes that a little easier to do, and thus makes adoption of an open source project a lot easier. The other angle on it is you have to make sure that you're not sucking all of the oxygen out of the room, especially for folks who are actively building open source. And so there has to be some measured way in which you engage open source projects when you're making use of them, to make sure that you're ensuring that not just the user community, but the contributor community remains viable. And that's a real challenge in terms of making sure that you're keeping all of those plates spinning for some of the projects that get adopted. But when I look at some of the amazing open source projects, and I'll pick on Airflow because Maxime's here, a number of different cloud providers are deploying it, and that's increasing the user base. And hopefully that's some market validation for startups who are working in the space and you know, it's been incredibly compelling, especially for AWS as customers. We're huge fans of Airflow and what's been built there, and trying to pick up the pace of our contributions and making sure that community stays healthy is a part of that. And that I think when you adopt an open source project to deliver as a service, one of the things that you've got to be thinking about is, how do we ensure that this community, in particular the contributor community, stays vibrant and healthy?
I want to just offer a little historic perspective. These days, you're right. The meme is that Amazon is killing open source, and back in the old days, it was IBM is killing open source. And I think it's just whoever the biggest player is, people are going to be paranoid about and make hurdle accusations, because they're big and they're doing well. And I think Amazon is engaging healthily, just as IBM did before, predominantly in open source. It's using the software, it's providing it to people. That's what you want when you write open source, when you build open source. More and more, Amazon is contributing, which is great. Unsurprising, since they depend on it for their business. They want to get involved in the community. So to me, it's healthy. It's a big player, and it's what organizations like Apache are designed to handle well. They were big players when Apache started, and Apache built itself in a way to insulate it from too much control by big players. So it doesn't. I think it's a false concern for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is in some. I agree with you guys. I think it in terms of like, it's kind of the rules of the game too, and it's a game. I think that's more successful. It's more competitive long term, and everybody wins, especially the members of community. People have like diversity of kind of managed service to run. Right, if you run Airflow today, you get 3 or 4 different options, and it keeps everyone honest in terms of like keeping things compatible. And be able to migrate from a vendor to the next. And it forced the vendors in some ways towards innovation too, right? So folks at Astronomer, probably the leading commercial open source offering or entity around Airflow specifically, they have to think about like, hey, what can we offer that is not just like bundled necessarily with Airflow, and how do we build an array of like services and integration and plugins that is compelling to our customers. So it keeps people innovating in some ways, and it's a little bit of a rite of passage, right? Like those are the rules of the games. As a commercial open source founder, you know that in your future there will be a time where Amazon and others, will probably start offering a managed service, and you have to see that as more validation, like growing the pie, right? You can think of like, oh, I want the biggest slice in that pie, and then someone else is taking a slice of your pie, and you're like, oh no, like I don't want to share my pie. You have to think like the pie is growing, and we're all winning is a mindset kind of around it. One thing I want to say though is that it's clear that when these offerings come, the incentive for the people in the project to build more trust and things that are not open source, maybe on the fringes outside of open source, or even like, hopefully they don't want to change the license, which I think that's where everybody loses. But I think like clearly when the diversity of offering, starts to appear, there's more incentive to push some cycles towards differentiation and building things around open source. And then at that point, maybe communities can lose a little bit, right? Where there's less investment directly in the core and more investment in the crust. But yet we have to see that as just kind of a life cycle thing and a natural thing that happens as, projects, community, ecosystems mature. Another thing I want to say too, the defendability, the best people to run a piece of software are the people who write that software. So that is a greater truth I believe in, and will stay that way. So if you want to run the best Apache superset there is, you want to turn to the organization that writes the bulk of it. We can patch it faster. We know how to deploy it. We know how to operate it. We know how to build integrations for it. So I think that's something that's really where the defensibility of the merit, exists. And that's an incentive for all organizations to contribute to core too.
I want to just bring up another way that it seems like public clouds are changing open source. And David, a few years ago, your employers invented something called S3, which didn't seem very exciting at the time. I remember looking at it and thinking, that doesn't look that useful. But it has turned out to have this huge gravitational attraction for data, where just about, and so the question is, if we're headed toward a world where literally every byte of interesting data and some not interesting data ends up in S3, how does this change open source software? These are no longer systems that they're consuming S3. They're not necessarily things you can build on a laptop. How do you do you guys feel that this is changing the way that people think about open source, where it's developed, who can develop it? Just throw that out. It's kind of vague, but I hope you understand the thrust of the question.
I do. I understand the thrust of the question. I'm not personally concerned about it, because at the same time that you see S3 hosting lots of data today, 10 or 15 years ago, that was systems from Hitachi or Samsung or Western Digital, that they were hard drives, and you had large storage vendors like NetApp who were consuming all of that. The difference is that that's all essentially via public cloud now, rather than bringing that on site. And so the move has become more internet connected rather than hardware connected. And I think that it has become in much of the same way that SCSI or IDE used to be the interface that you would go and access data. That accesses the S3 API or some other object storage API. So it is the same model, just a different protocol in many ways, to my mind.
We used to worry about data gravity a lot. You see a lot of concerns about that. Once data was stored somewhere, that it was too big to move, and you'd be stuck there forever. I don't think that's really materialized. Amazon's has services to make it easy to shift things around. They'll ship you hard drives that you can move your data on. But it's still potentially of concern that it's a different form of lock-in than software lock-in. The sort of having everything in a place keeps you in that place. But I think networks have gotten fast enough, and we see evolution in data storage systems running apace, and so people are going to move things around regardless. I just wanted to mention that whole issue.
Yeah, so to me, I'm not sure how to attach this to analytics, but I think clearly storage has been commoditized. Companies don't buy a hard drive or NAS or SANs anymore, which is kind of a great thing, to have this global abstraction for storage. We need open, if not open source libraries, and just open standards and APIs around that. I think that's appearing maybe as maybe that was not the original intention with the S3 API for it to become an open standard. And I think it is becoming such currently. There's a bunch of libraries kind of tying together GCS and S3 and probably other type of cloud storage or non-cloud storage. I know there's an on-prem S3 layer that you can put on-prem, so you can use Terraform and use similar abstraction in different contexts. But yeah, so the second best thing after open source, I guess, is open standards, and really it's nice to see that emerge, even though maybe that was not the premise around S3, that it would become an open standard. So backwardly it's becoming one.
Right. And it's kind of interesting that, for a lot of people, the data gravity is one concern, not being able to move it. The other thing is being able to own it, so that, it can't be taken away from you. It can't, things that are vital to your business. And it does seem that if you want to own your data, you have to own the software that accesses it. And it seems to me that this is a way in which, even in this new environment, there's going to be there's a new impetus to open source from people who are storing data in these open formats, and they want to continue to access it over time. That means the software that they use must remain open. I'm just curious what your reaction is to that thought. Do you think there's a point there that this will, that this will drive enlightened users to help, push open source, or do you think it's just not that important to them?
I mean, I think if you want to own your data, and are concerned about it, you should encrypt it. That's a certain way to make sure that nobody else is gonna own it. If you encrypt it and own the keys, if that's your concern. If you don't trust your cloud provider, if you don't trust your cloud provider to survive, that's another issue. In which case, you might keep a copy of it somewhere else. But I don't think people are seriously guarding against failure of their cloud providers at this point.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about like isolation, segmentation, why do you talk about the need of like isolating your data? There's all sorts of means to do that, virtually encryption being one, or when you think about the boundaries, like what used to be a private network now is a VPN, and it's kind of the same thing effectively, right? Except it's on the cloud. So I think we can, in software, it's easier than anywhere else to create whatever boundaries that we want to create virtually. Like virtual networks now are a huge thing too, where it used to be physical networks. So I think everything becomes software there. And then you talk about the need to isolate your data and keep it under your boundaries. I think that's always been an important concern, but increasingly too, like the need to share your data is also a really important thing. And S3 being kind of globally namespace makes that really kind of nice and easy. You can think of data just living somewhere and being accessible virtually by whoever you want to give access to, which is really powerful too, I think. Like sharing data is probably the, B2B, or just like in general where data lies and how it's shared and who owns it, becomes probably a really important thing over the next decade. Like sharing more than isolating, I think, is becoming a growing concern.
Great. The advantages are just so enormous of not having to own the hardware that stores the data and deal with all the failure scenarios and losing data and having offline time, all that. Yes, exactly. Just be done with that. I certainly keep all my photos. Every aspect of my digital life has been uploaded to the cloud as soon as I could. So I think companies do the same thing, and wisely. It's a hassle.
So we're coming up on we're running a little over, but I think we can go for a couple of minutes. I just want to circle, sort of conclude this by asking each of you, what is the most exciting thing that you see right now at the intersection of analytics and open source? What is that? And it could be the project you wish you were working on right now. So whoever wants to take that up, maybe we can go around and see what you guys are excited about right now.
I'll go first, and that leaves everyone else a little bit more time to think. One thing I think it's going to happen too over the next 5-10 years is just like analytics everywhere, right? I think we've seen like visual interactive analytics, namely like business intelligence, like it being really clustered and stuck in like specialized tools. And now I think with the rise of like just data literacy, like we're going to start seeing just like interactive visual analytics emerge everywhere. And that's powered by, fast cloud databases, by component libraries, by toolkits, just allowing developers and engineers and product builders to bring visual interactive data everywhere. I think that's a trend that's interesting to follow.
Other thoughts?
So, I see the analytics space as having become much more simplified over the past 5 years. And I think that makes it much more approachable. We see a lot more folks taking data and actually doing things with it. And that's really compelling. Doug obviously did a lot of foundational work around Lucene and MapReduce and bringing that to the world and making it easily accessible. What I see in terms of the things that excite me right now are the glue that's taking those foundational pieces and making it really easy for users to actually make use of some of this amazing technology. And you know, I know we think about how many years Lucene and I guess Lucene's over 2 decades now, right? And you know, we sit back and look at that and think, oh, that's old technology. And the reality is that might be old technology for some folks, but it is still groundbreaking. And it is amazing what it can accomplish. And we're seeing a lot of folks, you know, whether it's making Lucene easier to use or build a top, or it's making it easier to move data in and around various systems with things like Airflow. I think the tools are becoming much easier to use, and that's making the number of folks who are actually using them much broader. And that's the thing that excites me, is that folks are able to take this amazing technology and go actually deliver value with it. And that's, you know, the one thing that I'm super excited about is how easy it's becoming to do things that used to be essentially unthinkable, but by all but the largest companies.
I guess I think we're, I mean, Lucene's lived because it's evolved, because because it was open source, it was able to improve, and it's improved dramatically since I first wrote it. It's all been rewritten. It's a vastly superior piece of technology now than it was when I last touched it, which is amazing, and it'll continue to evolve. I think we've really started to reach this productive plateau with cloud, with open source. We're now understanding, I think, how to do open source startups better. We've been through a lot of these things, and we're learning how to do better integration of all these, you know, myriad projects that aren't under a single dominion. And I think it's should be an incredibly productive period right now. I think we've opened things up in a lot of healthy ways for folks doing data analytics. So I just point to that maturity of this ecosystem that we now have at our disposal.
Thank you very much. We're at time. Before we go, I want to thank all three of you, because you've had deep involvement in the Apache Foundation, you know, creating stuff for it, running it, everything. I think you've built, you and many, many other people have built one of the real cathedrals or the great cathedrals of the open source era. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. We all use your software and appreciate the contributions. And thanks for a great discussion.
Thank you, Alan. It was an honor.
All right. Thank you very much. Everybody, we'll go off to the next events. I'm going to go ahead and kill this. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.